All right, good morning and welcome to the Environment and Energy Committee. This morning, we are going to be hearing an update on the implementation of Act 59, which is our Community Resilience and Biodiversity Protection Act from the last session that established goals of conserving 30% by 2030 and 50% by 2050 of our lands for biodiversity.
Good morning. For the record, I'm Julie Moore. I'm the Secretary of Natural Resources.
And for the record, my name is Trey Martin, and I am the Director of Conservation at Vermont Housing Conservation Board. We're joined by Gus Seelig, who's the Executive Director. He is going to get up. He has to go at about 20 of, so don't think it's because the questions are not good questions. But just because he's got to go. Before we jump into this, because we wanted to provide a process update today, I just wanted to mention something about the photos throughout this slide deck. I'm not gonna, when we come in, we like to tell stories about the projects we've done, and we always include photos where we can illustrate VHCB's mission or our co-mission with ANR. This is Observatory Knob in St. Johnsbury, a recent project that we completed with the town there. It, as you can see, it provides open space. There's great tree cover on the backside of the knob, and it's a community resource. We have the slide deck contains pictures of projects throughout. I'm not going to stop on them, but if you want to talk about them later, if you're interested in VHCB's projects or if something catches your attention, you can feel free to stop us. But we really are here today to give you a process update on the work we've been doing since last summer. I'm going to hand it off to Secretary Moore for the next couple of slides.
Sure. So first, just refresh on the vision for Act 59 and the clear alignment it holds with the values of ANR and VHCB's organizations. Obviously, as you indicated, Chair Sheldon, in the opening, sustaining biodiversity is at the top of that list. Included in that, to my mind, is maintaining an ecologically functional and connected landscape. And so landscape connectivity is listed second. We know that the bill calls out water, aquatic systems, and water body health. Obviously, there's increasing attention on climate resilience and opportunities that present themselves through conservation. The role our working lands, both farms and forests, play in maintaining a forested and open landscape. The need to provide opportunities, accessible opportunities for recreation and just for folks to be able to get outside statewide. And then continuing to support Vermont's historic settlement patterns of compact villages surrounded by those working lands and natural areas. So 10 VSA 2802 contains the conservation vision goals. So again, that ecologically functioned landscape that's able to sustain biodiversity, provide for connectivity and watershed health, all of the values we talked about. Also, as you noted, Chair Sheldon, it creates goals for the state of 30% conservation by 2030 and 50% with conservation by 2050. And notes that reaching the 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 goals needs to include a mix of different types of conservation areas, ecological reserve, biodiversity conservation areas, and then natural resource management areas. And this work is to be done consistent with Vermont Conservation Design, which is an organizing framework developed by the Agency of Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife Department.
So the act that you passed last year has two phases. We're almost done just giving this kind of redux and kind of context setting, but just wanted to remind the members that we are in the middle of the first phase that's outlined under Section 2803 of Act 59. And that is, we have been referring to this as the inventory process. It's an inventory and a catalog of the work that we've done to date in Vermont to permanently protect land and to provide back to this body a accounting of the conservation work that we've done and how it falls into the different categories that the Act sets forth. The inventory mandate also sets forth a number of other questions, or there are a number of qualitative questions that it sets forth or it asks ANR and VHCB to provide answers to. And so that's what the more complex work of the last 9 months has been getting the right input, creating the right framework for input from stakeholders and professionals and practitioners to address those really qualitative questions that are set forth in the inventory mandate. Some of those questions have to do with the role of agricultural lands in our conservation program, the way that we protect aquatic systems through land-based conservation, how we're increasing equity in our conservation programs, the different kinds of practices and methods that we think that we've been using and that we think will be necessary to address these really bold goals that are set forth. And so there's been a lot of input, and we'll get into that as we go forward. But we've talked to hundreds of people and have spent thousands of staff hours at ANR and VHCB, as well as the partners. This has been a really huge effort by a lot of people in and out of state government, in the NGO community, in our RPCs and natural resource conservation districts, folks from advocacy organizations who've been participating, literally hundreds of people and thousands of hours to date to try and engage around these different questions. When we finish the inventory, we will deliver that back to this body. It will be in the form of a written report that provides analysis of and response to each of the questions, as well as some, a spatially explicit data set that shows what's protected and where and how it fits in different categories. That's sort of the midpoint of the work. That's setting the foundation and allowing us to move forward to then develop an actual prioritizing plan for conservation towards the 2030 goals, the 2050 goals, using the vision and the VCD, the Vermont Conservation Design Framework as the way to get towards those vision and goals. This is another 18 months of work after we get finished with the inventory process. And so at the beginning of the session following next, so we won't be done with that until the second half of the next biennium will be when we are bringing that back. Just a quick catalog of what we've done so far. When we set out to do the work, we gathered ANR staff and land trust and conservation professional staff in a series of all-day meetings to identify sort of who the stakeholders are. The Act provides some guidance, and I'll show a slide in a second, just as a reminder of who we were tasked with engaging with under Act 59. But what we did is then we said, okay, we need to list the actual people. And we made a list of over 150 people who we reached out to and said, do you want to participate in this process? Would you like to participate through an interview or a survey or participate in a focus group or other ways? And about 50 of those people responded by providing interviews back to our consultant team. We had over 150 survey responses you see here. 4 of the questions in that inventory mandate that I referred to, we thought required so much substantive work that we formed work groups. And we staffed those with people from the agency, from VHCB, and from the NGO community to help to provide a framework response or a set of recommended responses that ANR and VHCB can analyze and synthesize and bring forward into the report that we deliver. We also have convened over 20 focus groups, and we're still going. There are focus groups based on affinity groupings, so it allows people to come together in a space where they feel like there are other people who share their profession or their outlook, groups of forest landowners or groups of recreationists, groups of water quality advocates. So those focus groups are really based on people's the way that they choose an affinity basis for their work. We heard from BIPOC Vermonters, we heard from Indigenous elders in Vermont. We talked to in those focus groups, probably there were about 20 to 25 people each. So again, another 300 or 400 people. Some of them were the same people who we interviewed and who otherwise participated, but some new. And then we're working towards providing a draft of the report that we're submitting in early to mid-June, so that we can conduct a public meeting towards the end of June and get one more round of feedback from the public on what it is that we're providing back to you in this inventory. As I said, here's a quick list or a reminder. You've seen this before because it's in the Act, the public stakeholders who drive the work. But the initial partners who we've really leaned on and who really contributed greatly to this, besides the agency, our consultants at Nature for Justice. Zariah Hightower is the lead consultant, she has done far above and beyond what the contract called for, and has made herself available as often as we've asked. And then you can see Nature Conservancy, Vermont Land Trust, Trust for Public Land, Audubon, and the State NRCD Council. And then those public stakeholders are the one, again, that's taken directly from the act. So the landowners, land managers, conservationists, different groups around the state, all of whom we've heard from some representation of those groups so far in the process, and then we'll continue to involve them as we finalize the inventory and as we go into the planning phase. I'm going to hand it back to Secretary Moore. We have 2 more slides, and then we want to talk with you for the remainder of our time and see what questions that you all have.
Sure. So just a couple of pieces of summary, both in terms of what we have heard back through these listening efforts in terms of what Vermont is doing well, and then areas that will need continued focus and attention. So starting with what Vermont's doing well, we have a robust conservation community, including organizations that were represented on Trey's last slide, right down through local land trusts. And the importance of using Vermont conservation design to help have a shared set of priorities and as we look to future conservation efforts. Again, speaking to the Vermont community and the culture of conservation that exists here, this is really something that doesn't exist everywhere. It's been evident in the people we've heard from how important they see land conservation is as keeping the Vermont landscape intact. And that there is a lot of effective and ongoing education, outreach, and awareness efforts around conservation continually that are part of what's integral to the public engagement in this space. And then there was also a lot of talk around public and managed lands, the different uses that those types of lands are able to provide, from recreational opportunities to biodiversity to simply spaces and places to be in nature, and want to ensure that these areas remain valuable, enjoyable, and accessible, broadly accessible by the public. In terms of areas of continued focus, we've had a number of different conversations around the intersection between biodiversity, climate resilience, and our working farms and forests. Growing recognition of the need for capacity, not just for acquisition, but for planning what parcels, ensuring we're prioritizing the highest quality conservation projects, and perhaps more importantly, how we steward them on the back end. And I think that is a pressure that I know A&R feels in terms of stewardship obligations, but clearly exists in almost all of the conservation partners without exceptions. We've talked about where and how to make the best investments in land-based conservation that are protective and supportive of aquatic system health. That a lot of our work, or all of our work, is based on a willing seller principle. And so how we balance getting at that quality conservation, as well as some of the equity and access concerns that folks have raised, while continuing to adhere to a willing seller principle. Thinking about investments in protection versus restoration or enhancement. And those are different investment strategies, perhaps, and things that really need to be weighed carefully. The long-term funding commitment that's going to be needed, again, not just about acquisition, but thinking about stewardship and data management. And then recognizing that what Act 59 calls for is a really significant undertaking, potentially with a price tag of hundreds of millions of dollars a year to achieve those conservation goals, and recognizing that there will be a need for innovation if we are to achieve those outcomes.
And that takes us to the end of slides that we prepared, which we are pretty much right on the timing that we were hoping for to save, the rest of our hour to your comments or questions or the like.
Thanks for that update. This super exciting. It's great to see bill we passed last year be taken up and embraced by you both. so enthusiastically as your organizations and then all of our partners in conservation. So super cool. I have a couple of questions for you. And that's not critical, but just wondering, I didn't envision that the inventory was going to be a public outreach process. I guess I'm curious how you made that decision, and that the inventory would be more internal among conservation partners and the planning with external, reaching out to get input on how to go with this.
Is it okay if I take that first?
Oh, please.
Yeah, if you read the bill is clear that there should be a public process that is expressed in section 2804, which is the planning process. So you're right that technically we could have provided this inventory response without reaching out to any members of the public. But we felt like two things. One, we felt that there's so much qualitative analysis and table setting in the inventory mandate. It goes way beyond just counting up the acres and figuring out a way to compare gap status to the categories that are defined in the bill. And it doesn't make sense with the principles of outreach, engagement, environmental justice, and sort of community input that both of our organizations care about, to do all that qualitative discussion without hearing from people. And the second thing is that I don't think the organizations would have let us. There was so much interest and excitement about this. Even before you took up H126 last year, like in the fall leading up to the session, and then through the session, we were continually hearing from people who said, when are we going to start to be able to participate? How are we going to participate? How will we be included? So we presented that to our consultants and said, can you design a public input process for phase one that will really help us bridge to phase two and help us identify the stakeholders and stakeholder groups who can be part of this work? And it has made the process bigger. It has made it more complex. And sometimes it's been messy and a little unwieldy when we've had many different groups, working at the same time and feeling like they don't all have the information that everybody has. So that has definitely, there are pros and cons of having a big public process and not. And so we've dealt with both I think we achieved our pros and our outcomes, but we've also had people who've been frustrated by the size and the breadth of the effort so far.
Thanks, that's helpful. And I don't think you articulated the 4 work groups. You said there's 4.
Oh, yeah, I can say. So the 4 questions that we thought needed the most practitioner support were, number one, in section, I think it's in question 1 of section 2803B, it says, what should the categories be? Should there be any modifications to the categories or any additions to the categories consistent with the act? So there was a group formed to look specifically at that question. Also in question 1, which is a doozy of a question, there was a directive to look at and consider how the types of agricultural lands that support and enhance biodiversity. So we had a group that met that really was focused on agriculture and the opportunities for investments there. We had a group that focused, again, the aquatic systems health question that Julie talked about. How do we use land-based conservation with willing landowners to affect aquatic system health that runs between lots of properties and isn't susceptible to parcel by parcel management strategies in the same way that a regulatory strategy would work. So we had a group that really leaned into that. And then finally, there was a group that was looking at there was a question about how to manage state lands to achieve the goals for the biodiversity reserve category. And so there was a group that mostly A&R led with some external practitioners thinking about how the long range management plan process at A&R can help us to create more term ecological reserves.
And are they still meeting? What's the status of those work groups?
Those groups have produced initial reports for us, which then now we have a sort of a group of partners who are reviewing those reports, analyzing between the different reports, finding places where there's tension or ideas that need to be resolved. And so we're meeting once a week for the next 6 weeks to sort of, with a larger group to try and synthesize those reports with what we've also heard from focus groups, what we heard in interviews, and what we heard in the surveys. So it's a pretty big analysis and synthesis effort right now.
So the work groups their work is done.
Other than when we get to the point of saying we think these are the recommendations we're carrying forward into the formal report, if we think that there's a need for the work group to weigh in, we'll go back to the chairs who organize those groups and ask them how they would like to involve that's sort of the group who had contributed to that. If they would like to meet again to consider what we're doing. Do they just want to work with chairs of the other groups to resolve issues? So we'll have some process, but we haven't decided that it has to be this way or that way.
I kind of had hoped to hear from the chairs of those work groups. It sounds like you're not really excited about that. I'd love to hear then what are those points of conflict, or what's the status of those work groups and like what's going on in them?
Well, like I said, for every question of the 10 questions in the inventory, we're preparing a separate appendix. And that appendix is prepared based on all the feedback that we've received. For the questions that have a work group report associated with them, that's sort of like the center of the appendix is providing that report. So those reports are going to be provided to you in whole as part of the document that we prepare. In terms of what we're looking at right now, there's a set of questions to resolve. How we're addressing system capacity for all the different kinds of investments that our different work groups and focus groups and people have asked about. How do we recommend to you to structure the agency, VHCV, and provide support to NGOs to build the system? What are we doing on working lands, and how do we resolve some of the issues, the tensions that happen on working lands? And there's a tension on agricultural lands between the impact of a intensive land use that can have a negative impact on biodiversity. But the totality of our farmland conservation results in much more protection of forest land, wetland, meadows, and that sort of thing. So, but we can't ignore the fact that there are impacts from that kind of land use, and there are impacts from some kinds of silviculture that we balance. So that's an issue that we're continuing to talk about and think about how do we make a recommendation back to you. There are a lot of, I think we already talked about this, but we're trying to think about how to respond about water. It's, the willing seller principle and the fact that we do conservation parcel by parcel and not in a whole river system or in a whole, wetland system means that you can really improve and enhance the relationship between land and water on the parcels where you do conservation and enhancement. But if other parcels in that reach of river are not, then you're still not going to have a connected and healthy river system or wetland system. So how much effort do we want to put into that? What's the outreach and education opportunity? How do we do more when we're conserving for agriculture and places as well? So that's a set of things that we're continuing to refine how we report back to you. Equity and access has come up a lot. Not just equity and access to our programs and to the funding that our agencies provide, but to this process. And so we're working on how to reflect back to you both the positives as well as the difficult questions that raised about access to this. And then the innovations piece, and innovations have been recommended by every work group, and most of the focus groups have talked about, well, what if you did this, or what if we had this new system in place? And we want to pull forward what we think are the most actionable. So that's a scattering, Chair Sheldon, of different issues that we're still resolving coming out of those reports and focus groups. But I have like a 7-page document here listing them that I will not continue to sort of read down. Also, the last slide that Secretary Moore spoke to. These are the questions we're still resolving. And we're going to continue to resolve them into the planning phase, we think. Because many of them aren't just as simple, like, does this add up to 40 or does it add up to 42? They're much more qualitative questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And are the draft reports available now from the work groups?
Yeah, if you're interested in them, I can get you copies, and they're posted on our webpage for this, which I'll also give to Will so that you can see all the things that we're putting onto there.
Great. Representative Stebbins.
I had 2 questions. One is withholding judgment and conversation about what may or may not happen through the rest of the legislative session with S213 and with H687. If those 2 move forward, and wondering what your thoughts are, because these are separate but also connected and will have a lot of overlap in terms of, some of these questions, how to balance landowner rights, not necessarily the willing seller principle, because it's a little different, But also in terms of the public outreach, what your thoughts are, assuming that those two bills become acts, in terms of how to leverage this work and integrate it with some of the work that's discussed and defined in those two bills.
Maybe I'll
Yeah,
start
if you wanna-
and then I'm happy to have you weigh in.
Yeah,
But I think one of the areas of discussion, in addition to the things Trey talked about, was particularly as we think about 50 by 50, what the role of regulatory programs are in achieving our conservation objectives. I think the River Corridor Permitting Program envisioned by 213 is a component, but there's also wetlands regulations, for example, that are currently on the books. And it's a permitting program, right? So it's not a no never, but it's going to place some fairly significant constraints on development in any of those settings. And on the wetland side of things, envisions mitigation occurring to offset, more than offset, any impacts that occur. And so how are those things accounted for, credited, tracked? It becomes a data management challenge as part of this larger conservation strategy. So I don't know that I have answers to your questions other than it's an issue that we are actively talking about how to fold that those programmatic pieces also into the conservation inventory.
may I say another word about that?
Please.
I refer the committee back to in the bill, we talk about having permanent protection for the 2030 goals. So achieving 30 by 30, we talk about permanent protection in a way it's the work that we've been doing, that Gus has been doing his whole career at VACB, that ANR has been doing on all those years. It's the acquisition of development rights through conservation easement deals. It's the purchase of land as public land. It's the protection of municipal land and town forests, all permanently in perpetuity, right? That's why stewardship, why we keep mentioning stewardship, is so expensive. When you have to plan to take care of that land forever, it's a big burden on whoever has that legal responsibility to steward that land going forward. That's what we have been doing up till now. This act calls for us to add another probably between 180 and 250,000 acres to the 1.2 million acres that are permanently protected right now for 30 by 30. For 50 by 50, the act speaks to long-term, enduring, or durable protections. And so it's an open question, and I think a policy question going forward is, does a river corridor, does S213 provide the kind of long-term and durable protections that we think of? Does the H687 Tier 3 framework provide that kind of long-term durable framework? Does current use program provide that long-term durable program that we think of for 2050? And those are some of the innovative questions that I think we need to think about in the planning phase that help us to say, even though it's a pretty big lift, not joking around, to get 180,000 or 200,000 acres to permanent protection in the next 6 years. We're spending, the blended cost with all those different factors going in is more than $4,000 or $5,000 an acre. So that's a pretty big lift. We're going to put our best effort to that, and the plan is going to speak to that. But I think the good news is that we have these other programs and innovations that, as we work towards that, we know that we feel pretty confident about 2050 because there's so many other ways that are long-term durable protections for the landscape. I'll just leave it right there. I could keep talking to you about that, but.
Well, maybe we can offline, but
Yes, I have.
my follow-up question is, you had kind of touched upon the relationship with agriculture. And personally, I feel like as much as we talk about budget challenges, I feel like Vermont has so much opportunity for really creating a strong economy if we really connect back to healthy food, bringing in tourists and that outdoor rec. So I'm wondering, in your innovations area, has there been, I've never been to France, but I've heard like lots of people go there mostly because of the food and it's so yummy and it's so beautiful and they feel so close to the agriculture. Wondering if there's been much talk about the innovation side of how do we preserve and protect and conserve while also really growing a healthy, sustainable economy, building off of our natural resources in that innovation conversation?
It's a great question. Right? Yeah. Well, I've never done agritourism in France either, but I did stay at a Turisma B&B in Italy one time, and it was lovely with my mom, and it wasn't a working farm in the way that I think of a lot of our farms here that was relying on the production of agricultural commodities. It was the B&B was what was supporting her. And so that's one of the questions we hear from producers is, can we bring a blended business model to this? And there's accessory on-farm business that, there are a number of places where you're already working on that. But that's a really important thing, is how do we diversify the opportunities for agricultural producers to earn income so that that's a more sustainable sector of our economy. That's one way. Thinking about ways to support that community through conservation. I mean, that's one of the most important things that we do at VACB, is help, especially at the time of transition of ownership or transition between generations, is making that land more affordable through conservation or through the purchase of a option to purchase an agricultural value, which holds the prices theoretically of that land down for the next purchaser, and make sure that we're passing that on from producer to producer. Our farm and forest viability program offers a lot of support to both forest-based and farm-based businesses to develop business plans, to identify small and medium investments that are going to help their business be more successful. And the news is that it's a terribly fine line, and farms go out of business every year. Dairies have suffered in the last years. The Horizon dairies really got hit hard a couple of years ago. Those organic dairies that were contributing to that. So even with all those supports, we haven't come up with the right innovation yet. And whether China's thirsty for our milk, somebody told me once, is really the biggest driver of how successful our producers are going to be. It's what happens on the global market and the milk pricing, which is, it seems like to a lot of people, like a kind of a black box. How does that end up being there? And then if you have events like last summer that make the cost of feed go through the roof for producers, and they're not insured against that or underinsured against that, how do they survive those times?
Yeah, I was thinking definitely dairy, but also broader agriculture at large. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. You talked a little bit. First, I want to tell you that we have a conserved view in Derby, and Commissioner Seelig has seen it. Yeah, we got it accomplished. Now we're just building a big parking lot there. But we've got a beautiful view of Memphremagog, Magog, and the town of Derby is going to take possession, if we haven't already. We're going to own it forever, and the view is always going to be there. So
Good news.
about 25 acres, and it's pretty nice.
I've been following this at some distance, Representative. I'm glad that you've.
You should come up and see it, because we've improved the view. We've improved a view that I didn't think could be improved. So anyway, on that note, or off that note, 30% by 2030. Right now, Chittenden County is 8%. The Orleans County area, Northeast Kingdom is at 43%. So that being said, by 2030, if Chittenden County is still at 8%, what are you going to do about it? Have you made any plans for finding or threatening or closing the highways or anything like that?
Plans, yes, and that's after that the sentence departed from where we've been going. No, just trying to be.
I hear you.
But yeah, we don't exercise. We wouldn't exercise takings power. That's not in VACB's set of authorities and powers. It's not something that we would do. Conservation is always a willing landowner working with a trust or a municipality or VACB to protect that land or selling that land to those people in fee. So we have never compelled anyone. And that's one of the sticky questions about how to implement this law with conservation design, which identifies the highest priority areas of the state for conservation, but it's not compulsory to a landowner. They look at that and say, oh, well, look, my 1,000 acres of forests fit within this highest priority area. That could be the end of it for them. Or they could say, wow, I'd like to enroll in silviculture, current use, or I'd like to talk to VACB about conserving this. But it's really about pull, Representative. It's about outreach. It's about education. It's about having the right kinds of funding. And it's about helping people understand the connection between community health and these outcomes. And it's making sure that we have enough capacity in the system so that if somebody says, hey, I'd be interested in this, that then there's a partner who's willing to go there. We've got the funding to be able to support that partner. We've got the funding to support that acquisition. There are a lot of organizations, good ones up in Chittenden County who are thinking about this. And they're also taking a blended approach from what I understand, thinking about where conservation would happen, but also where does zoning help? You know, what do you do with municipal zoning to protect certain areas, having overlay districts? I don't think, as I read the law, zoning, which can be put in place and then changed, isn't a permanent protection, but it's a tool that, you know, local governments have to participate in this.
Do you think that they have the capabilities of achieving 30 by 30?
I think we have,
With what they've got for a land mass right now?
in Chittenden County,
Yeah,
I think there's enough open land. But I haven't studied that carefully enough to give you a sort of scientific
it
answer.
will be interesting.
Well, and to be clear,
no,
that
please.
this is a statewide target, not a county by county
That's right.
target.
Good point, yeah.
And frankly, it was actually established first as a national target, as opposed to a state by state
Well-
target. And certainly there are states, particularly out west, where.
I guess they have picked districts that they're, or have they gone by counties as to what the percentage of conserved property is?
Who's,
Sure.
you mean as we're looking at the inventory?
Yeah,
We've been looking at it statewide and seeing all the land that's protected in those various, through those various mechanisms statewide. I mean, we could just, you know, we can look at it certainly at the county level, but it's not, we are not gonna set, I don't think we're planning to set targets county by county. It's a statewide goal.
okay. One,
Actually, can I just interrupt though?
Yeah.
Because envisioning utilizing conservation design, and the goal is to look at biophysical regions and meet goals within the biophysical regions, which are not the counties, but certainly would be my hope that the inventory, if it doesn't do it right away, but would be easily we could break that down by natural community type, by physical region, and, you know, region, so that we understand where we are
Yes.
in identifying particularly natural community types that we may be at risk of losing because of their proximity to our built environment.
Secretary Moore and I have been really thinking how we can do a effective and manageable process to produce this plan for you over the next 18 months and what is the best strategy. And we've talked about the biophysical regions as that is a good organizing principle. Again, I'd remind that because conservation design identifies, you know, about 58% of the state as having highest priority value. So it's a good starting place, but it doesn't help us go from there to establish priorities for what comes, like, what would be the waterfall of our funding? What are the highest priorities that we know we want to tackle over the next 3 or 4 years? What are the priorities if we had additional funding? What are the priorities that we'd say, hey, philanthropic community and NGO community, you should go after this set of priorities without public money? You know, so that's, I think, what we're going to be trying to produce back in this plan is like, what's the strategy for expenditures that we think is most likely to push us towards that goal? And you know, right now we are not, I think we're producing, you know, 10 to 12,000 acres a year of conservation and that's a not conservative guess. That's like assuming best case scenarios.
that's what you're purchasing?
Right now, I think that's what we're accomplishing statewide. I don't know, Gus, if you,
Reducing, not purchasing.
yeah.
Yeah, so that's a combination of easement acquisitions the feds may make from time to time, acquisitions we do with A&R for state lands or that kind of thing. So that, and I think that's on the upside of where we've been. We're probably actually a little bit below 10,000 acres in recent years.
So if you refer to acquisitions, does not necessarily mean purchasing the property.
Oh, it can mean buying an easement as we have on many
I hear that.
occasions. And I can't quite frankly imagine we can meet these goals just with public acquisitions or nonprofit acquisitions. This has to be a partnership that's going to include, as it has throughout our history, private landowners.
And federal partners, the folks up in Milhegan Basin and Conti Refuge, the U.S. Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, those are really important partners for us. And they're doing some really important work in Conti right now. And that all that land is, that's the like backbone of Vermont's conservation is those federal lands. And then we've done so much work with A&R and with private landowners. But I think we're talking about needing to triple or quadruple the rate of production to meet these goals.
The federal was one of my questions. I'm not sure I noticed the federal, have they been engaged in any of the work groups or the process so far, our federal partners?
Not in the work groups, but in the inventory and interview phase, we've talked to some of the federal partners, and we are inventorying those lands, and we are in touch with those folks, but that's a pretty easy set of things to inventory right now, because it's
Yeah.
where it is.
So it would also be informative to know what their plans are in the short, immediate plans and longer term plans, like, it varies over time.
It does.
How much they pursue acquisitions.
Not only those agencies and their acquisitions, but then the Forest Legacy Program that is competitive across the country provides a lot of funding through the Department of FPR for the purchase or protection of larger forest swaths. But we don't know from year to year how much of that funding will come to Vermont or whether even any will come to Vermont in a given year.
It's a competitive,
Yeah,
a nationally competitive program. We tend to fare pretty well, but there is no guarantee there, so it's hard to predict.
Senator Leahy created the program, so it helped while he was sitting in the Appropriations Committee. Whether that largesse continues for Vermont is
To be
up to the next generation.
And so that's a program that varies annually.
Yes.
And do you know off the top of your head the range of what we get there?
I don't off the top of my head, but I can get that for you. I mean, we submit at least one application each year, and then they rank the applications nationally and sort of work down the list. So some of the a smaller dollar amount in a year may not be reflective of us actually doing less well. It may be reflective of the fact that what we proposed was a smaller project in that given year, depending on agency priorities and landowner willingness.
So that's project specific money.
Yes.
Correct.
Do members have other questions? Anyone else? Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam. Just want to say, thanks for your hard work. I know it's not easy to get people like that together and listen to everybody's opinion and try to decipher everything, but
What do you mean?
Is that what you do all year?
Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate that.
Yes.
And we had at least one group where we were presenting that what we're doing well and what's the challenge. And our consultant sort of went quickly through the what we're doing well because she really wanted to get to talk to the group about those kind of where's more focus needed. And the group said, whoa. Like this makes it sound like we're just all fighting all the time.
Yeah.
And the consultant said, well, if you're sitting where I sit, you're hearing a lot of people saying that they do like this or they don't like this. And then you go to the next conversation and people say the opposite. And so while there's this general amazing culture of stewardship and appreciation in Vermont, the specifics of this bill have brought out a lot of people's like the specific issues that their organization or that they care about. It's easy to bring that energy into a process like this. And some people are really good at navigating that. And some people are like, more like, no, I'm going after this. And this is my chance to make my kind of like advocacy point with these folks who look like decision makers to me. And so that isn't always easy, but it's important. We have felt like we have to create the container for all those people to be able to speak up. And we've said, if you tell us what your values and goals and hopes are, we'll make sure that that is reflected in this report in some place. It may not be the recommendation that we end up making, from VHCB and ANR, but you will be heard. And that's the approach that we've taken.
So thank you for that. It is very easy for all of us to focus on where we don't agree. And we have certainly often more places where we agree than we don't agree, but we come together to work out the places that we don't agree on. One, just since we have a little time, I've noticed in the kind of consulting world that this idea of affinity groups is taken on. And I wonder just where you are in the process, what your perspective of it is. It feels a little bit to me like, and even possibly some of the work groups, I understand the work groups maybe a little bit more, but the idea that you're in an echo chamber if you're just with people that have the same agenda or need that you do versus taking that time to work out differences with people that might have a different perspective or priority. Just curious, like, I mean, I know you're in the middle of it and that's the path you've chosen. I get it. Anyway, I guess I'll just put that out there as a question I have, because I just think it's an interesting twist or turn that I've seen, not just with your project, but others. And at this time when we're really, I think, also trying to say, oh, wait, this is particularly here. We know this is a big question and there's like, it's got to be addressed holistically. Is it really good to break us down by a kind of user group or affinity group? Not sure what we get for that.
I think it's another pros and cons decision that, you know, there are ways that it's really effective in creating a safe space for people to come and talk about hard issues without being countermanded and or cross-examined during the presentations. And yes, I think largely, I agree with you that largely the issues that are facing us as a nation and as a society has to do with the people we're not willing to talk to and disagree with. And so, yeah, we've tried to be very cognizant of and reminding people that even if we're creating affinity spaces where it's, you know, there's going to be more of that echo chamber, that doesn't mean that we aren't going to have to reconcile these things. And then, you know, we are going to try to do that in a conflict transformative way, as opposed to a just top down, this is what ANR and DHCB decided and you all got to live with it. So finding ways to bring people together who disagree and have them at least help us work it out. And then we'll make decisions based on that if we have to, but that's sort of the goal. Yeah, I think there have been some of those affinity spaces where we wouldn't have had a successful conversation if we hadn't done it that way. And there have been others where it resulted in us getting a lot of feedback that's like the 19 people around a circle all saying kind of more or less the same thing.
I guess I'm also curious if there are any of the more creative ideas to address some of the challenges that we were aware of going into this and that we've talked about today, that you can share with us, like in terms of the long-term goals of conservation. And yeah, have you heard any, I don't know, anything new that we haven't talked about or that has really struck you as like, that's going to be worth at least spending more thought on?
I don't know if there's anything we haven't mentioned yet or that you're not aware of. I mean, there aren't just like, I mean, this is going to depend on resources, and finding resources at a time of shrinking resources is a challenge that's one thing where no matter how creative the secretary and I are in this process is, that's hard to overcome. But we've talked about the role of regulatory structures, whether there's statewide regulatory structures or municipal regulatory structures for that 2050 goals. And how do we incent really thoughtful BCD-based regulatory structures that would have those management outcomes that we're looking for, connectivity and biodiversity-focused outcomes. We've talked about UVA, which is one of the, if not the most successful conservation programs in the country in terms of its acreage and percentage of the state that's enrolled. Those are, you know, year over year, the withdrawal or addition to that is pretty negligible. So that's a pretty stable body of work, but it doesn't count towards the 2030 goals, but does it count towards 2050? Or do we need to tweak it a little? That's a question. We've talked about different financing structures, and, you know, other states and places have worked with outfits who do different kinds of financing. This has worked really well where there's an outdoor recreation outcome that has a pull towards the community, and then the revenue impacts in the community that come with having like a Kingdom Trails. I know the Trust for Public Land and Quantified Ventures did a big project in Ohio, the Wayne State Forest there, it was an area of coal subsidence, so they brought in a lot of, you know, finance-based investment to build a big mountain biking destination, and the impact on sort of town revenue, tax base, property values has been tremendous, just very similar to the East Burke story here in Vermont. So those are places where you do have like an outcome later. In terms of ecosystem services, we know that the value of $1 invested for conservation, Trust for Public Land did a study about 6 years ago and said that the ecosystem service value of that dollar is $8 of return back to the society, but it's not a cash flow solution. So we have to decide that we value those, like if we conserve a farm, and we think it's really important to protect the wetlands on that farm permanently and to conserve a buffer that's, you know, 50 feet instead of just, you know, a 15-foot buffer. So taking more out of production, that has a value to that producer. And we need to think about what that value is to them over time and think about a different way to appraise that so that what we're asking them to do and contribute to the downstream communities is recognized as more than just the foot by foot or acre by acre value of a place that you grew hay yesterday. So I think that's the beginning of the list, Madam Chair, but I wish it was more exciting. California called and they wanted to give us $50 billion because they're done with their 30 by 30 and, all we have to do is sign here, but they haven't called yet.
Yeah. Well, we are anticipating that your deliverable will include a reality check on the cost.
It will.
And that is in the deliverable. And then kind of on another topic, I anticipated that the recommendation for a fourth conservation category would be part of this, which would be the agricultural lands. And I really appreciate that you're putting effort into looking at the ag lands that can support biodiversity. But I also think that to the larger goals that we have as a state and a region to also be more food resilient and grow and produce more food locally and hopefully not have to sell our milk around the world to China, given the cost of doing that in multiple ways, but that we produce the products more regionally that we need here. And I think Vermont's well suited to do that. So I would expect a fourth category of conservation is highly likely going to be part of what we get back.
Yes, I don't think it's not whether or not it will be in there, but sort of how we organize that very much to some of the issues Trey raised, recognizing that parcels conserved for agriculture actually often reflect a variety of different land uses and land types, and trying to make sure we're able to tease some of that apart, but also being very cognizant of the data quality of the data that's available to us, and that it only works as sort of farm scale conservation as opposed to maybe parcel by parcel.
I mean, let's say there's 250, 300,000 acres of conserved land in Vermont that has some sort of agriculture on it. Some of those parcels are mostly agricultural production, mostly hay or corn or other vegetables or grazing lands. Some of them have less than 10%, less than 5% in any kind of agricultural production. There's maybe 250, 280 acres of woods and wetlands, and then a very small field. Then there's everything in between. And so the whole parcel often includes all these different values. So it's not like we go out and say, we just want to conserve this part of your parcel or just want to conserve that. So that's one part of it that has made this very interesting. The other is that we have these twin goals of promoting climate resilience and connectivity through this act. And then New England wide, there's a goal for being able to increase the amount of food production spaces across the region. And the same lands sometimes can do both and sometimes they can't. And so how we factor for that and plan for that is just so important.
All right. Thank you for joining us this morning and for all your work on this. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks for the time. Thank you.
We are adjourned. Members, actually, though, just to remember, we have a couple bills for third reading that should be probably taken up, I think, this morning. 687 will be this afternoon. And just please stay on your email and be aware that we may need to come in to hear amendments or otherwise talk amongst ourselves. So we are adjourned for the morning.